So I started out in the AV industry as a freelance technician. I came from theater. I had worked in a roadhouse. I'd been involved tangentially with audio visual. I knew what a slide projector was, how to set it up, you know, knew all the tricks about, always having a quarter in your pocket and a tongue depressor, as we called them, for managing slides. I knew the basic AV stuff. I could plug in a microphone. I knew the difference between different types of microphones, and I found freelance work. I think the ad was looking for film projectionists, and so I knew how to run theatrical 16 millimeter interlock film projectors, which actually has nothing to do with AV equipment, except that when somebody put me in front of a Kodak pageant projector where you actually had to thread the film, I knew how to do it. And then there were the Bell and Howell projectors where it auto threaded for you, and it was, anybody could set it up, sort of thing. So being a freelance AV technician was not a highly complicated job back then. But I came from theater, so to me, I was doing a show. So if I was put into a room and I was responsible for, turning on the microphone before the speaker went onto the stage, hitting record, turning the lights up, playing a video, showing slides, I knew how to frame images on the screen. I knew how to dress things. I knew how to time. I knew how to hit, 5 cues in succession to lower the house lights, raise the lights on the stage, roll the video, take the lights down, to bring the lights back up when the video was over. I knew how to do all of these things. And so I was very comfortable doing the show part of shows. Not always a great technician because I didn't understand how, high-end electronics worked, but we weren't using high-end electronics. We were doing meatball AV. It was very simple stuff. The hard stuff would come later in my career. So I was good at that. And I was good at, dressing things out and making sure that it was safe to walk through a doorway without tripping over a cable and all those things. And as I became more experienced, I got put on bigger shows and working with other talented, generally staff technicians, because there weren't a lot of freelancers back in the early 80s. But as we did bigger shows, now we're setting up large screens, doing rear projection, doing 18 projector slideshows, which I did thousands of, it seems. And I spent a lot of time working backstage. And so backstage was my domain as a projectionist because that became my primary function. Lots of detail, lining up projectors, lots of precision, staying up late, coming in early. We were the last people in the ballroom at night, the first people in the morning, and a ton of time backstage in the dark. And what would I do backstage? I'd tidy. That was my thing. Not during the show, of course, but, during rehearsals while we're still setting up, I'm tidying backstage. I didn't want to see presenters having to walk behind the screen and get their head in the projector. So I was, putting tape on the ground, putting little lights on the floor like we do in theater so people know where to walk, getting the cases lined up against the back wall so that they're not in people's way and we're not stacking, the housemen aren't putting all of their plates and bus trays and stuff onto our cases because that would impede our ability to get to a mic cable if we had an emergency. So I just started dressing backstage, and that's what I became known for. I was good at that. I was good at running crews. I'd been on a crew for years. Had a lot of experience running crews. So I was probably the de facto, crew chief or project manager on most of the jobs that I was on. Didn't mean I was the best technician. It just meant that I was the person who people let be in charge because we were rarely assigned that job. We tend to say, well, who's in charge today? And people will say, well, let's let TR be in charge because he's going to do it anyway. And I said, well, you're right, I will. So that's how my career got started. Now, some point in time, God bless him, Tom Alford came to me, and it was the first year of Alford Media as a production rental company. And I was out there working the shows and helping put crews on shows and doing all the things I'd been doing with them for years in the previous companies that we worked with. And he had a point in time he came and said, hey, I need help here. I need somebody to make sure the shows get out the door correctly and get the orders prepped correctly and get our warehouse set up correctly, and maybe help me sell some things. And the job I was hired for was to be rental manager. And the sacrifice, and the reason I applaud him for this, is because while I was extremely valuable out in the field, and I was the person who'd go set up the show at midnight so that the A-team crew could come in and run it in the morning and not have to stay up all night to set up their show. I was very valuable out in the field, but he said, what he's doing, his highest and best use would actually be here. So if we put him here in the office, then we're going to get benefits from it. And we don't know what they are. And I think if you ask Tom today, he had no idea what I would do. He just knew that I was going to bring something to the party, and it was going to, most of the time, make his life easier, though probably not all of the time, as we'll both admit. So thinking back on that part of my career, I want to share with you what happened when I came into the office and how that involved to what I today call planning. So little history lesson, but it's very relevant to what many of you are going through now, because you are starting right about where Alford Media was when I was hired full-time to work in the office. And by the time I left, they have a great system, continue to have a great system. And maybe you can understand how you can iterate that outcome in your world, because all it takes is understanding where you're trying to go. Keep listening. Welcome to your weekly dose of uncommon sense, helpful insights, and tough love. I'm your host, Tom Stimson. The Intentional Success Podcast comes to you through the generous support of Mertz Crew.
Mertz Crew helps top AV companies book quality AV freelancers. Your choice, your rates. We handle contracts, insurance, and payments. You save time, cost, and reduce risk. Start today at mertzcrew.com.
Now on to the show. All right, so it was 1991 is when I took a full-time job. Technically came in off the road, though I wasn't off the road immediately. But, technically my job was to be in the office. And my title was rental manager because we didn't know what else to do. And rental manager was a pretty powerful title in that day and age. If you went to any of the big companies in town, we had Bauer AV, rental manager is very powerful. We had AVW, rental manager is very powerful. Hoover's Audiovisual, which later became J&S, which later became Inspire, the rental manager is very powerful. And they hired, all the freelance technicians. They scheduled all the gear. They did most of the sub rentals. They scrubbed most of the orders. They worked closely with a warehouse manager to get stuff out the door. But basically, they were the air traffic controller of the business. And so that was the job I was hired to do. And I also learned how to, I started writing orders and talking to customers and doing sales. Very, very complex full service role like you would find in a small company, right? When you're in a small company, you wear a lot of different hats. You have a lot of conflicting priorities, but we had the luxury of putting a person who knew how to do a lot of things and knew how to solve a lot of problems into a role. And I was also very good at managing priorities because that's what I did on show site. I was good at shifting gears. How can I get from this? And then I go back to that. So I have to take care of, we call it putting out the fire. And as soon as you put out the fire, you got to go back to the job, the most important job that needs to get done next. And it was a hectic job. Anybody who worked around me will tell you that it was, 10 hours a day or more. It was nonstop chaos, nonstop calls coming in and going out. Very, very busy job. Honestly, people actually stood outside my office and waited for a turn to talk to me to move things along. And it was exciting, but there was a lot of learning and going on, because what I understood more than anything else is that every job that the company depended upon me to do also depended upon me to teach somebody else how to do it. Because if I couldn't get out of that job, if I couldn't train my replacement, I would have to do it forever and everybody would suffer. So I was constantly figuring out, how can I train my replacement in what I do? And this is a lesson I learned from my dad in his corporate life. He went through I've shared the story before about him going through years of promotion. And I asked him, why was he getting promoted all the time? And he said, it's simple. He goes, as soon as I get a job, I assess how everything works and I figure out how to delegate all the responsibilities of the manager to the team and work myself out of a job, right? And be able to go to my boss and say, you no longer need a manager in this area. This area runs itself. And he'd put me in another role. So he'd put me in a director's role, and I was in charge of a lot of managers. And I would take what took 10 managers and get it down to 5 managers. And then they wouldn't need a director anymore. And then they moved me into a vice president's role, right? So that's what was going on in my mind. I've got to learn how to do all these things and teach other people how to do it, so I'm not the one who ends up doing it. So I made a list. Ha, surprise. I made a list of the things I learned how to do first. Because in 1991, we had just bought our first computer for the company. Actually, we were sharing it. The bookkeeper got the first computer. It was just a little one of those old-fashioned Macs with a simple program on it for keeping books. And then Tom Alford and I shared a computer that we'd write quotes on. And, when he was not at his desk, I would go to his desk and write quotes. And then later we'd move that computer to my desk. And when I wasn't at my desk, he came to my desk and wrote quotes. But the first thing he asked me to do was he handed me what we all knew was a pull sheet, because it was a sheet of paper. It basically listed all the equipment that we owned with room to write in more stuff. And that was a shop order. And he was used to just handing it to the warehouse guy and say, pull everything that looks like this, and then I'll come out and tell you what you need to add to it. And so he handed it to me. Tom handed it to me, and I had a warehouse manager, and I wasn't just going to hand it to this because this wasn't complete. So I started scribbling down things on it that needed to be included in all this. And then I handed it to the warehouse manager, Pete, who would go out there and start prepping stuff. And then when it was prepped, the job was to go through and find all the things that should have gone that might be sitting like a cardboard box full of cables. I kid you not. I literally said, all the cables in that box, put that on that pile. We need to take it. We need a cable that's in there. We don't have time to sort the cables out. Just send them all. And so we didn't have cable lists. We didn't have cable cases. We didn't have cable packs. We just sent all the cable we had. And then if there was cable left over after setup, we'd bring it back to the shop and use it on the next show. I am not making this up, but we were getting the work done. So first thing I learned how to do was how to scrub orders. Once you learn how to scrub an order, say, hey, here's the stuff I know we're going to need. Then you start packaging stuff saying, hey, when the show comes back, why don't we take all the AC cable, the extension cords, and all the power strips, and why don't we put them all in one box together instead of mixed in with everything else? Let's separate those things. Why don't we separate the microphone cable from the BNC cable and the RF cable? And so we started packaging things loosely, but we were loosely packaging things, which led to our cardboard boxes are wearing out. Can we buy some cases? So now we're buying some cases and trunks to put cable in, which was easy because you can use them for anything, but we didn't leave the cable in there. We took it out when we came back and used the case for something else. And then we had some delicate pieces of gear that needed specialized casing. So we were buying cases, and all of this changed what our pull sheet looked like. So our pull sheet got fancier, right? Scrub, package, cases, pull sheet. Okay. That's an iteration. Go through that 50 times, and where will you be? Where will you be? Another thing that evolved in this process. I booked most of the crew. Tom booked crew. We'd confirm a show. He'd tell people. I'd tell people. We had a lot of crew on staff. We knew we needed freelancers, and so we were booking them. We were putting them in the order, because remember, we had that, we're up to 2 computers now, putting them into the system so we knew who was on what show. And then, we got to get them some travel. So we had a travel agent, and, they would book the travel and send the travel documents. We're in the early 90s, folks, documents over to the shop. So we had airline tickets and, rental car reservations all printed out and sent over to get distributed to the show crew, cash per diem, all those kinds of things. And there's so much complexity and detail on there and so many questions to answer that the first hire that Tom made to help what I call planning was he hired an assistant to help him, but he gave her the responsibility of also scheduling the crew, telling the crew where they were working, and booking their travel and getting their travel information, which is a huge load off of both of us. So we started booking travel and booking labor and looking farther ahead, which led to the scheduling meeting, which we had on Tuesday mornings. So we called it the Tuesday morning meeting, and we would book freelancers out and staff as far out in advance as we could. We knew from looking at the schedule if we needed to find more freelancers. If we had a weak position, we need to replace somebody. If this crew was overcast, had too many good people on it, and we needed to dumb it down a little bit. Otherwise, it'd be a different kind of chaos. And that worked over and over again. It got better and better and tighter, right? So nowhere in that process was the person booking travel and informing, booking freelancers or informing staff of where they're going, making any decisions about who was going to do the work. They were simply doing the fulfillment of that Tuesday morning meeting where we looked at all the shows ahead and scheduled people, right? And that led us to doing something similar with with travel logistics. Trucking logistics much later on when trucking became a much bigger deal. But we weren't done. So now we've got the pull sheet thing getting better and better, the packaging in the shop getting a little bit better. That led to systems and kits. Now I've got a little bandwidth. We're always sending this stuff out. Okay, why do we keep leaving this piece behind? Well, we didn't know it went with that, or it wasn't on the list. Well, it's always on the list. I put switcher system, and that's part of the switcher system, which led to the purple book, which was a 3-ring binder. It happened to be purple, where we started putting in pages for each system that we regularly use that says, if this switcher goes out, here are all the things that automatically go with it. And eventually it had cable and accessories. But at first it simply had, here's the switcher case, here's the router case, here's the 3 basic monitors, but we need another monitor for every source. There were tons of monitors back then, guys. All of those systems were made up of kits. Sometimes a kit will fulfill a system. Sometimes a kit would be standalone, and we'd like to double duty our thing. So we built systems and kits, which improved our pull sheets. Going back to that first thing, made the prep simpler. It made scrubbing an order much simpler. So now scrubbing an order, by this time it evolved to the warehouse manager printing out the order from the computer, bringing it to me. And I would take a pencil and I would go down the list and say, okay, we need this many long cables. Here's the mic cable case that we need to send on this show. And I would look at the show and I would customize the cable package for every show. I would look for missing accessories, things that we didn't put in the quote that we know we need. Do we need cable ramps? Things like that. And I would handwrite all of that out. Now, teaching somebody else to do that became a lot easier when the systems and kits, and I was just saying, send 2 medium AC cable cases, send 2 medium microphone cable cases, send an extra audio snake. All the accessories automatically went. So now it became easier for somebody else to scrub the order. And the iteration of that was soon the warehouse manager was scrubbing the simple orders, bringing it to me, showing me what they did. I'd give them a few tips and coaching on things to improve or change, hand it back to them, and off they'd go. And over years, it got better and better to the point where I no longer scrubbed orders, right? How is this all planning? Because this sounds an awful lot like operations. Well, let me tell you, if you get operations sorted out, it gives you the bandwidth to do the planning that you need. And planning for your events, it starts with technical planning. You've got to look at the whole job and say, technically, how are we going to fulfill this? Is this equipment going to work together? What do we move around? Is there anything that we have to fabricate, create, obtain, subrent to make all of this work? Do we have the right people to make this work? Technical planning, okay? Now it's resource allocation. How do we allocate resources? What do I subrent? What do I buy? Do I put it on this show or that show? Procurement. We've got to do the sub rentals. We got to book the travel. We got to hire the people. We got to rent the trucks. We got to get the scissors lifts on site. We need 3 camera chains from Victor Duncan. All of that procurement stuff had to happen and had to become centralized, right? Documentation of all of this. We have to send the crew a complete packet so that they know what is coming their way, so they know where to find things. So it came to documenting what was going in the cases and putting stuff inside the case lid to say, here are the standard items, but on a gang trunk, you had to put something on the top of it that says, this is what's in this trunk. We've combined all these individual SKUs in here, and here's where to find it. So documentation became very, very important. And then putting it all together, the fulfillment of putting all these things together and getting it onto show site, getting the right people with the right information, with the right truck pack, with the right gear package, the right way to facilitate a smooth and easy load in with minimal crises. And then the last part of planning is always the support, because the better you are at planning, the less extra support you're going to have to give, but the more important that support becomes. And so now we're running logistics on, hey, the customer's added this. We need to get this here. What's the drop dead? Well, I need it as soon as possible. That's not an appropriate answer. I said, what's the drop dead? Oh, if I have it by 4 o'clock, doors are 5, we can get it set up in time. I said, awesome. I'll have it there by 3. All of that part became this centralized resource of taking all the bits and bobs of our jobs and putting it together logically and systematically, repeating our successes over and over again, constantly improving on them, is what we're going for. And the outcome of good planning is the show crew, the execution team, has everything they need. They know where everything's going to come from, where it's going to be there, who's involved, everybody's phone number, all the information from the client, all the agendas, all the floor plans that are necessary to do their work, okay? And make sure that the questions they have are minimal. We provide for as many circumstances and, oh, by the ways, as we expect to happen. And they know that those things are there. They know how many extra of everything they have tucked away in a case. They know how many times they can say yes before they have to call the shop or call the salesperson and say the client is adding this. That is planning. And that is the evolution of the planning, because of all the things that I've been teaching post-pandemic, planning is the one thing that hasn't actually changed. I've just repackaged it. Okay. And it's operations management led by a knowledgeable production person that is serving the goal of meeting all the needs of execution in advance, not going out and doing the show for them, not going out and supervising them, trusting them to do the work, put the right people on the show, give them the right tools, and get back to your desk and plan the next one or the next 10. So that little history, that little evolution of my career through the Alford Media days led to my views of planning and what it takes to have an effective planning team, who, by the way, none of my team ever went out and did a show. It wasn't in their job description. People who do shows for a living did show. People who plan shows for a living keep planning shows while that show is going on. That's the key to growing your business. Whether you are 8 employees or whether you're 800 employees, the model still applies. So thanks for letting me share another long podcast, but I'm having fun reminiscing and connecting it to the stuff that really matters to us today. And I'm looking forward to watching many more years of improvement in these models. Thanks for listening.
If you liked this episode of the Intentional Success Podcast, please leave a review and don't forget to like and subscribe. This podcast has been brought to you by the helpful folks at Mertz Crew.